You need to know the details, because, for example, in the story that you laid out, I don't know if that was, how much of that outcome could be attributed to the situation.
Well, let's just say it was a justified kill, but it still haunts him. I think it probably haunts a lot of the team members that were a part of that operation. But whether it was justified or not, he's still struggling with it.
Yeah.
He doesn't feel... I don't want to speak for the man, but it obviously bothers him because it got brought up right away. And he wants to bring that up here. And so...
Well, what would I investigate then? So imagine he's torturing himself. And imagine he's doing that in a way that is counterproductive. And that's also counterproductive in relationship to his family. Is that helping or making it worse? Right? I mean, so that's something to think about. I'm speaking hypothetically because obviously I don't know this person. I don't know what their situation is, but almost everyone has other people depending on them. And if you overburden yourself with guilt and take yourself out, you're going to hurt people around you. So you have a moral obligation to not do that if you can avoid it. So that's one of the things I would investigate to begin with. I would find out, well, exactly what happened. What were the situational requirements? Conscientious people tend to overestimate their culpability in any given situation and downplay the situational factors. And that's called the fundamental attribution error. And it's particularly true for conscientious people. So I do very careful analysis of the situation and find out, well, was it likely that anyone would have done that in that situation? Okay, well then there's another problem that comes along with that, which is, well, what does it mean about life that you can be in a situation where you have to do something terrible to proceed? That's a religious question to some degree. And there are ways of addressing that. In terms of atonement, likely what I would have him do is I would ask him, to begin with at least, is like, well, imagine that you were counseling one of your friends who has this problem, and you wanted to help him calculate a pathway forward that would enable him to get on with his life. What would you require from him? What sacrifice would you require for him? Because people will often burden themselves with an impossible moral task, and it's not helpful. It's not right to take yourself out of the game, right? So I can't be much more specific than that because the devil's always in the details. It has to be personalized. One of the things that I've done with people who've had post-traumatic stress disorder is I've familiarized themselves with the literature of horror. That's very useful. So there's a book called Ordinary Men that details how a battalion of German police officers were turned into the murderers of naked pregnant women in Poland, one step at a time. There's a book called The Rape of Nanking, which is about what the Japanese did in China at the run-up to the Second World War. The woman who wrote that, Iris Chang, she committed suicide. It's a rough book. Human beings have a very dark side. And now and then, what happens to someone who's traumatized is they run into that dark side. Well, how would that be conceptualized religiously? Well, if you meet Satan at the crossroads, there's no necessity that you're going to recover from that. Like, these are realities. In fact, they're the deepest realities. That's why people break apart in a situation like that. They come across something that's so dark that they just can't function. Well, the first thing to become aware of is that's actually how the world is constituted. It's constituted as a landscape of good and evil. We're very bad at teaching people that. We portray it in our movies, always, in action-adventure stories, always a landscape of good and evil, a mythological quest, the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Marvel universe. Those are all landscapes of good and evil. What we don't understand is that is the landscape. Now, partly we don't understand it because we're in pumpkin shells, right? It's like, normal middle-class existence. There's not much good in it in the extreme sense. There's not much evil in it in the extreme sense. It's all middle of the road. But that's not life. And if you're in that pumpkin shell and you're naive and then you encounter life, it's like, well, good luck to you, because you are completely without resources in relationship to how to deal with that. People have an immense capacity for darkness. But it's bottomless. It's bottomless. No matter how bad you think someone can act, there's something someone did that was worse than that. Mm-hmm. And no one wants to go there. And people, even when they conceptualize themselves, when people read the history of Nazi Germany, they always think they're Schindler. They always think that they're the person who would have saved Anne Frank in the Netherlands. They never read history as a perpetrator. I wouldn't have done that. It's like, did you watch people during the pandemic? In Canada, 30% of my neighbors were thrilled that they had the opportunity to inform on the people around them. Thrilled. They would have worn those goddamn masks for the rest of their life if the payoff would have been they could feel morally superior and inform. And so, people have a very dark side. And see, once you start to understand that, it also lifts the moral burden off you to some degree. It's like, well, you aren't who you think you are. You're way worse and way better. And that's your friend, for example. He discovered that. He discovered he was way worse. It's like, yeah, that's the world. That's reality. Okay, now you know that. Now you know that. You're no longer naive. You might say that. What do you do about that? Well, that's the next question. The antidote to evil is good. And good is deeper than evil. I don't know how good your friend would have to be in order to free himself from his entanglement. Maybe he has to become a saint, so to speak. Could be. There's a lot of atonement there.
I think the fact that I appreciate the fact on people who think like that, because so many people just justify their wrongdoings in their head. They justify why they did it, and they look for reasons to convince themselves on why they're sinning. Why do you think why is it so hard for people to just admit wrong instead of justifying?
Well, so that's related to that question you had about pride. We like to be right. If I'm right and you're wrong, I don't have to change. And so that's pretty convenient for me, because there's a desert part of change. Like if I have to change, I have to fall apart and then I have to put myself back together. It's very annoying to fall apart. If you're arguing with your wife and it turns out you're wrong, then you have to go figure out why you're wrong. God only knows why you're wrong. Like maybe it's a deep wrong, maybe it's a pattern, and you have to take, maybe 10% of you has to go, something like that. And that's a kind of death. It's really hard. And so people will insist that they're right so they don't have to change, because change involves sacrifice. Change involves death. When you learn something new, the stupid part of you has to go. And it has to die. And that's actually painful. You might have put a lot of work into that stupid part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And then you have to let it go. And then it's not like like I said, it's not like you're better as soon as you let it go. No, you're just lost on that front. Then you have to figure out what to do instead. In the religious orientation, what you try to do is you try to replace insisting that you're right with trying to find out how to be right. And that's the opposite of pride. That's humility. It's like, okay, there's some pathway forward here that I could journey down if I could only specify what it was. My wife has started praying the rosary, and she does that every morning for about an hour. It takes her about an hour to orient herself properly because she's trying to be grateful, practice it, right? To orient herself upward, to recommit to the truth. That's the attempt to find the right pathway rather than to insist that the one you're on is already right. It's a completely different orientation. In the Christian landscape, that's something like Christ within me and not me, not my will. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you replace what you want with the attempt to do what's right. Well, what's right? Well, truth. So in our conversation, I weigh my words. I'm trying to find the words that are solid. That's the pathway forward. Each word is a stone on the water that specifies the pathway through chaos even. If you're in a tight situation, you should be very careful with what you say, especially if you're around dangerous people, say. And so you weigh your words, and that's an attempt to find the pathway forward instead of to insist that you're right, in your current configuration. It's a form of faith, too, because you might say, well, do you want to put faith in who you are, or do you want to put faith in who you could become? And it's way better to put faith in who you could become. That's a much better deal. Then you can give up who you are. You've put your faith in the right place. You don't have that tyrannical insistence that you're right all the time. When I'm dealing with my wife, like we're trying to sort something out, what's my aim? I want to sort this out so we don't have to fight about it anymore. I want to put it right. And if I have to give up something stupid that I'm doing to put this right, that's okay, because what I'm aiming at is peace and tranquility and romantic adventure. And that's the pathway that I want to take forward. And if I have to give up something idiotic about myself to make that happen, I'd like to find out what it is so I can get rid of it as fast as possible. That's a sacrificial offering. Right? There's an insistence in the biblical corpus that sacrifice is the pathway forward. There's no difference between that and maturation. There's no difference between that and work. Those are sacrificial offerings, right? They're delay of gratification. So you sacrifice what you want. That's what you do when you work. You delay gratification. You sacrifice what you could be having right now for the future. It's a sacrifice. That's the communal. That's the communal orientation of human beings, that sacrificial pathway. And if you're smart, you look for what you can sacrifice. Why? To replace it with something better, always. And that's your upward aim, and that can be the antithesis of that sort of pride. You're prideful.
Do you think that's a good thing? Sacrificing for the future. I personally struggle with this because there's the live in the now, which when I can do it, I feel great. And then there's the sacrifice for the future, which we all do through work.
The Sermon on the Mount is about that.